Hello, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm speaking from the unceded ancestral lands of the Stolo indigenous peoples, and by making this land acknowledgement, I reaffirm my responsibility and commitment to supporting indigenous peoples to have their stolen lands returned and their livelihoods restored. Today is the 31st of December 2022, my very last day as David Lam Chair in Multicultural Education. And this masterclass is a way for me to wrap up the year. You will find a link to a report of my activities as chair in 2022 below this video. This masterclass presents a social cartography of stacked toxic challenges faced by Indigenous, Black, and people of color in navigating what Sara Ahmed has called the will to diversity in academia. Drawing on Sara Ahmed's work, as well as other scholars who have taken the affective turn in social critique, in this presentation, I will argue that the institutional will to diversity is not necessarily a will or commitment to interrupting the naturalization and normalization of colonialism or white supremacy in academia. This presentation was created for colleagues who identify as IBPOC as a way to visualize the complexities, paradoxes, risks, costs, and price that we pay as we navigate academic spaces where the normalization and naturalization of colonialism and cultural supremacy are uninterrupted. My intention here is to give words to some of the problems that are difficult to articulate in order to alleviate the burden and impact on our health and well-being. Since this masterclass was created specifically for an IBPOC audience, it will use language and analysis that may be triggering or cause cognitive and emotional dissonance to people who do not identify as IBPOC. If you want to watch this presentation and you are not IBPOC, I ask you to take a step back to observe any resistance, anxiety, or discomfort that may emerge for you. If you would like to explore what this discomfort and resistance can teach you, there is a list of resources below the video that can support you with that. I will start this presentation by briefly recalling the social cartography I showed when I applied for the David Lam Chair in 2021. Then I will show the social cartography that emerged in my term as a David Lam Chair in 2022. And I'll conclude with reference to a board game that is currently being developed in collaboration with IBPOC colleagues, artists, and students that attempts to bring this new social cartography to life, so to speak. So the social cartography that I presented before in 2021 compared how different generational cohorts have been exposed to different ideas of inclusion. This cartography also signals towards how changes in conceptualizations of inclusion are related to wider social and economic changes in society, how the zeitgeist of each generation is conditioned by social and historical factors. So it's important to note that generational analysis are pedagogical devices that enable us to make connections rather than accurate or objective descriptions or heuristics. Remember that the map is not the territory, and there are variances that are not captured by this exercise. So, here we have a distribution of 4 generations, W, X, Y, and Z, that is based on changes in communication technologies from analog to digital to virtual. This distribution also highlights how capitalism itself has shifted over time from industrial capitalism to neoliberalism to speculative algorithmic capitalism. The understanding of these wider changes is important to the understanding of how questions of inclusion have been perceived, and have been perceived differently by different generations. We will look at 3 different waves that represent different approaches to inclusion. The first wave is the wave of inclusion as assimilation that was most prominent from the 60s to mid-80s, and therefore generations W and X have been heavily exposed to it. This is the wave where Canada is seen as a mosaic, but nobody asks what keeps the pieces in place, which in this case is white glue. The second wave is the wave of inclusion as representation, recognition, and redistribution that becomes very strong roughly in the 90s. So in this wave, we generally compare equity and equality using a baseball game as a metaphor. But nobody again asks why are people watching this baseball game? The third wave, which many institutions are experiencing strongly right now, is the beyond inclusion wave, where Generation Z is leading a charge for a change of meaning of the meaning of inclusion and the terms of engagement. So here you have calls to decolonization and the cancel culture really coming in heavily as a way of naming and shaming what Gen Zs believe needs to be changed. So it's important to highlight that all these waves of understanding are still present in institutional context. So in a department meeting, for example, you may have people who see inclusion as assimilation, others who see inclusion as representation, others who want to go beyond inclusion, people in between, and people who just want the discussion to go away. Often people who hold one of these positions are unaware of the position of others. In this context, again, IBPOC people have to carry the weight of this complexity and the paradoxes that this complexity generates, often with detrimental consequences for their health and well-being as well. In the social cartography that emerged in my term as David Lamb Chair, I focus on how these different waves manifest for IBPOC people as stacked weights that we have to carry in order to navigate institutional spaces where colonialism and white supremacy are normalized and naturalized. Talking about the normalization and naturalization of colonialism and white supremacy in professional environments is tricky because the topic can be an emotional minefield, especially if the person raising the issue is also IBPOC. As Sarah Ahmed states, if you point to the problem, you become a problem. Even if you don't point to the problem, being the only or part of the few IBPOC people in a space already raises the tension and the anxiety of people unconsciously invested in white supremacy and dependent on it for their sense of merit, status, authority, and stability. People who uphold these investments will be anxious and concerned about accusations of systemic discrimination and will project onto the included IBPOC people several burdens. For example, the burden of representation, of speaking on behalf of all IBPOC people, of validation of benevolence, of affirming the goodness and innocence of white people, of gratitude for the opportunity, of proof of competence, reliability, and of respectability. Which means the aspiration to act as close as possible to white sensibility as proof that you are deserving to be included. So living with these burdens or stacked weights is very taxing for IBPOC people, whether or not we aspire to trouble the status quo. BIPOC people or IBPOC people have to develop survival strategies within institutions organized around white sensibilities. An important part of survival is to learn to read the room, including the tensions in the room, in order to anticipate projections, expectations, punishments, and retaliations, so that you are not caught off guard by surprise. IBPOC people tend to develop filters of speech and behavior that can keep them safe, and sometimes keeping safe means being as invisible as possible in order not to trigger fragilities and increase the amount of emotional labor one has to do. Other strategies include keeping oneself and one's work under the radar, presenting as extra kind and non-threatening, keeping cards close and opinions to oneself, choosing battles and associates very carefully, or becoming a model minority who can be supported and celebrated by the institution. Those who do not develop such strategies will be constantly battling micro and macro aggressions, will probably not have the time to do anything else, and often end up in deep exhaustion, anger, and frustration, which is read by institutions as proof of incompetence and unpreparedness, and which in turn leads to BIPOC or IBPOC illness, burnout, and eventual walkout or dismissal from by the institution. Therefore, my intention with the cartography of stacked weights is to visibilize these toxic challenges as a step towards the development of strategies that can improve our health and well-being. So here we have the 4 stacked challenges, and in this cartography, the first weight is the weight of the unchallenged naturalization of colonialism and white cultural supremacy. The second stacked weight is equity washing. Like greenwashing and whitewashing, this weight represents institutional efforts to use equity, diversity, and inclusion as a way of not interrupting the naturalization of colonialism and white cultural supremacy. The third weight is related to lateral violence and the dynamics of using oppression as a currency in a multicultural capitalist competition that renders solidarity virtually impossible. The fourth weight is the weight of obstacles to IBPOC leadership. We will go briefly through each of these challenges separately, but I will focus on equity washing since this reflects patterns that are very pronounced in Canadian institutions. But before we get there, I will offer the definitions of white Western cultural supremacy that will be used in the remainder of the presentation, and also a caveat. So, the white Western cultural supremacy in this presentation is defined as a set of three specific entitlements. First is the entitlement to universal epistemic and moral authority. Second is the entitlement to unlimited and unaccountable autonomy. And the third is the entitlement to the pervasive arbitration of truth, justice, lawfulness, and common sense. My caveat is that these perceived entitlements are mostly unconscious. They are unconscious investments whose conditionings we are all unevenly subject to within modern colonial systems. The problem here is both cognitive, affective, and relational, and cannot be solved just with more information, more policy, or more goodwill. Therefore, I'm not treating cultural supremacy as a moral problem, but as a collective, metabolic, systemic, and neurobiological impairment. So let's start with the bottom weight of unchallenged naturalization of white supremacy. Nelda Marcus Green says that white supremacy is not the elephant in the room, it is the room. And the same could be said for colonialism or of colonialism. So, in the layer represented by the stacked weight, white people who have not been challenged in their investments in white supremacy will see themselves logically as the apex of humanity, the ones who are most fit to lead the modern single story of progress, development, and civilization. And therefore, they are the rightful inheritors of the entitlements of white Western supremacy that we mentioned before. In this context, other cultures who want access to progress, development, civilization as defined by white supremacy need to pay tribute and an entry fee to those who have allegedly historically moved humanity forward. Colonialism, in this logic, is a kind of a gift of settlers to indigenous people, as it lifts them off their backwardness. And the violences of expropriation, dispossession, destitution, and genocide are perceived as collateral damage to the larger, benevolent, and worthwhile project of civilization. People who want access to the entitlements of whiteness through wealth accumulation, fame, social mobility, merit, or other things, need to mimic the behaviors and sensibilities associated with white supremacy. And even if you do mimic things successfully, you will always be what Homi Bhabha calls not quite, not white. In this context, it's very likely that if we receive the favor of being tolerated in a space, and if we speak or act out of place, we will be swiftly put in our place, back in our place, through ridicule, delegitimation, demonization, pathologization, vilification, deficit theorization, or sabotage. If we are perceived as rebellious, our work will receive extra scrutiny and we will be disproportionately punished for any mistakes that we make. Now, I invite you to safely visit a memory where you have faced this challenge and had to carry this weight. Try not to embody the emotions in the memory, just observe what happened. Think about how you responded, how your response landed, and the impact this interaction had on your health and well being at the time. Would you respond differently from the space you are in today? How do you prepare yourself to respond to these patterns in the future in generative ways while protecting your health and well being? As I go over the other stacked weights, I invite you to keep these questions in mind. So, the second weight is the weight of equity washing or conditional inclusion. In the layer represented by the stacked weight of equity washing, different from the previous stacked weight, People invested in white cultural supremacy tend to recognize some of the harms of colonialism and racism and are eager to themselves correct some of the wrongs of the past. They see themselves as saviors of marginality, and their sense of self-worth depends on them presenting and being validated as the good ones. Acts of inclusion, then, are dependent on the affirmation of their white benevolence. So in this context, how IBPOC people are treated will depend on a cost-benefit calculation that can be mapped around at least three possibilities. IBPOC as charity cases, IBPOC as respectable model minorities, and IBPOC as threat or competition. IBPOC persons who are perceived as charity cases will be seen as and helped as an opportunity to display white benevolence, which is something that endorses white superiority and can offer an alibi to criticisms of inequality. BIPOC persons who are helped are then perceived to owe the helpers eternal gratitude and availability to validate white benevolence and to defend white saviors against accusations of their complicity in systemic discrimination. IBPOC persons who are perceived to be invested in the same entitlements of white supremacy, often by adhering to respectability politics, and who have no intention to interrupt the status quo, will be championed as model minorities, elevated to decision-making positions, and paraded as examples of virtue. However, when these BIPOC people fail to meet the expectations of their champions, they will quickly fall from grace and be deemed undeserving of the trust that had been bestowed upon them and ungrateful. IBPOC persons who are perceived as competition or as a threat to the status quo will receive the harsher treatment of vilification, demonization, and aggressive deficit theorization. They will be perceived as gaming the system and deriving illegitimate advantages from it. Therefore, we will be celebrated and welcomed as long as we agree to recognize our debt for being included, to be grateful, to be in the equity photo, to celebrate the hospitality and generosity of those who celebrate us. If we don't, as Sara Ahmed eloquently states, every time we raise the problem of systemic discrimination, we will become the problem and face more sophisticated forms of retaliation, such as gaslighting, tone policing, reputational bashing. Our account of events will be deemed less credible. We will be accused of creating a toxic environment or even bullying and harassment, or of violating respectful environment policies. At UBC, the report on the President's Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence Task Force has actually documented many of these institutional patterns that create a hostile and extremely stressful environment for IBPOC people. So here is a quote about how complaints are handled that illustrate Sara Ahmed's point. So it says, the POC committee asserts that the UBC system for reporting and handling complaints is fundamentally flawed. Regardless of whether POC file complaints or are on the receiving end of complaints filed against them, the system disadvantages POC, perpetuating the racial injustice they experience. Complaints of racism are regularly dismissed or diminished to the status of interpersonal conflicts. When addressed, the complaint process is often lengthy, and POC complainants endure demonization. They are treated as the perpetrators during and after the process. It's not uncommon for POC's accounts of events to be treated as less trustworthy than those of their white counterparts, and they experience retaliation. So I wholeheartedly welcome the documentation of these patterns, and I thank Professor Handel Wright for chairing all the committees that put this report together. But it remains to be seen whether this documentation can translate into the interruption of the patterns that they address. As I said before, this is not a problem of ignorance that can be solved with more knowledge, but a habit of being that has been socially sanctioned. In equity washing, the celebration or respect for diversity becomes a form of consumption of palatable versions of diversity. And this celebration and consumption is conflated and confused with the work of interrupting the naturalization and normalization of white supremacy and colonialism, which is much more difficult and painful work than the celebration of diversity, and which requires the boat to be rocked. So it's very difficult to keep harmony while you're trying to change these patterns. So in order to be allowed to enter into existing spaces where colonialism and white supremacy may have been challenged but remain uninterrupted, IBPOC people have to meet conditions that appease white anxieties. I have listed 4 of these conditions here. Let me see if I can change to that. So one condition is about allowing oneself to be consumed and displayed, for example, posing for the equity photo. Another one is adhering to or not challenging existing institutional norms, not rocking the boat. The other one is expressing gratitude or deferring to or affirming the benevolence of those who included you and feeling indebted. And the last one here is shouldering the emotional, relational, pedagogical labor of organizational change. So agreeing to being in service of appeasing white distress that is created in this process. I will now turn briefly to the 2 other stacked weights. So in terms of lateral violence, the stacked weight of lateral violence is one that I include here with some hesitation, as conversations about it can be easily weaponized in the political dynamics of protection of white supremacy. The stacked weight refers to IBPOC competing with each other for limited spaces and resources within an already saturated market of multicultural capitalism. In this context, our heterogeneity surfaces, the fact that we're complex and diverse, we don't necessarily agree with each other, and that we have different interests and aspirations in relationship to where forward is and to how we want to challenge colonialism and white supremacy. In this context, oppression can become a currency, and oppression Olympics can emerge, where the more oppressed you claim to be, the more deserving you are. This dynamic tends to divide communities and to render solidarity impossible. What I'm talking here is it's not the same as intersectional violence. When we're facing this type of lateral violence, we will be challenged by other IBPOC people on the grounds of degrees of authenticity of claims to marginality and legitimacy of representation of community interests, whether we are the most oppressed or represent the interests of the most oppressed. While these questions can and should be legitimately raised in certain contexts, they can also be weaponized to placate competition, so to speak, and that's where damage accumulates fast, with again serious consequences for the health and well-being of IBPOC communities. It's interesting to note that this dynamic of weaponization itself is grounded on the conditions of inclusion set by the normalization of white supremacy and colonialism. It works as a divide and conquer strategy that pits people and groups against each other, fighting for crumbs at the feet of somebody else's table. So the next stacked weight is obstacles to IBPOC leadership. The stacked weight refers to the glass ceiling, the glass cliff, and to double standards in the expectations placed on IBPOC leaders in the evaluation of IBPOC leadership competence. The glass ceiling refers to obstacles to being promoted, so being seen as fit to lead. The pattern here is to actively prevent IBPOC people from having access to the usual pathways to promotion, while blaming IBPOC people for not having that access. The glass cliff refers to the promotion of IBPOC people to higher positions when the chances of failure are more likely, for example, in times of recession and crisis. In this case, if an IBPOC person makes a mistake, they fall off a cliff. There are also double standards and expectations placed on IBPOC people in the criteria for evaluation of leadership competence. IBPOC leaders are held to higher standards than their white counterparts, and their claims to leadership are usually illegible by those expecting them to fit the white masculinity traits that are traditionally associated with leadership. In the historical context of colonialism and white supremacy, IBPOC people are constructed as naturally subordinate. And this construction surfaces when IBPOC people dare to step up to positions of leadership. This can be seen in how white and IBIPOC leaders are expected to be in service. While white leaders are respected and celebrated when they demonstrate selflessness and altruism as they practice service leadership, IBIPOC leaders are expected to act as natural servants who should work as aids to other people's agendas and ambitions. In this context, being IBIPOC is antithetical to being a leader. These four stacked weights can be at work in any academic space today, and IBIPOC people carrying their load may be compromising their long-term health and well-being. The image of stacked weights is important because it invokes a burden placed on the bodies of IBIPOC people. If the weights are carried and lifted in appropriate ways, they can build muscle and stamina. But if they are not, they can cause permanent injury and even break somebody's back. In order to learn how to face and carry these weights appropriately, we need to see the risks and costs involved in navigating academia as an IBIPOC person. To this end, within the mandate of the David Lamb Chair, I have started a collaboration involving IBIPOC colleagues, artists, and students in the development of a board game. So the board game takes you through different scenarios where you accumulate or lose credits. There are institutional credits, community credits, and health and well-being credits. So you throw the dice, you land in one of the squares, and when you land on a square, you draw a card with a scenario representing an example of a pattern of systemic discrimination, classified according to the stacked weights. So here. In each scenario, you will have two options: to challenge the pattern by rolling the dice again, or to pass and support the continuity of the status quo. If you decide to challenge the pattern, the dice will determine how many institutional community or health credits you will gain or you will lose. If the number is even, your challenge was successful and you may gain institutional community or health credits. If the number is odd, you will lose credits, especially health and well-being credits. Negative health credits can lead to frustration, resentment, bitterness, burnout, and also dysfunctional rage. And if we look at the context of IBIPOC communities today, you can see many of these patterns already there. So the game is meant to visualize the difficulties we face, to help us evaluate our coping strategies, to activate self-compassion, to enable healing, and to help us to work together in identifying effective strategies to interrupt the naturalization and normalization of colonialism and white supremacy in academia. We intend to publish this game in 2023. So I really hope you have found this presentation useful. I thank you for listening, and I wish you the very best.